Thank you for coming. We're a humbled group, but I thank you for coming. We felt it was important, the district felt it was important, the school council felt it was important that we look to recommit to bringing speakers in. We had a few speakers come in a few years ago. We had turnouts like this, which is okay, especially where, if it's something that we look to offer, parents every few years. I think that really makes sense for the size of our communities and the size of our district. I want to just introduce Patricia McCarthy with a quick story and why I think I feel, the best connection with this topic and with Patricia out of the 3 speaker series or 3 speakers that we've had. So our first speaker who came in a few weeks ago was Michelle Cove, who is co-founder of Media Girls. Her focus was on the societal pressures that girls, teenage girls in particular, feel in our society. She did co-author a book that was a New York Times bestseller that was really focused on the teenage girl and the relationship with the mother and father. Her presentation wasn't so much focused on that. I shared that with her towards the end. Having a daughter myself, I was looking forward to that piece. But certainly it was actually better connected to our curriculum, health and wellness curriculum, than I expected. So that was worthwhile. And then if we jump forward about a month, we have Nancy Carlson-Page coming in, who is the author of Taking Back Childhood, who, if I have a mantra for middle school years, is they're still in their childhood. And let's do everything we can to keep them young, to keep them innocent, and away from the societal pressures that exist. Gone are the days of, grow up. That term doesn't sit well with me because our kids grow up too quickly. So Nancy Carlson-Page is coming in. That audience is expected to be very large because that is during our 5th grade parent orientation. So Patricia and I were actually talking about, kind of wrapping some of these events around already established nights. So Nancy Carlson-Page is expecting vast and large audience. If you are interested, I do ask you to RSVP. I think we're pretty close to having to close out that event because I do expect this cafeteria to be full. So just a quick story about how I became connected with Patricia. So first and foremost, I started my professional experience about 25 years ago working at an all-boys summer camp for boys who really struggled in public schools, who really get in a lot of trouble in public schools, but not so much trouble that they were expelled or they were in police custody or anything like that. It was really just those students who may have had a mild discipline record and needed an opportunity to get some of their energy out. And what better opportunity than summertime? So I stayed with that camp all through my public school teaching experience. So in total, it was about 17 years that I spent at that camp. Again, all boys. I think I know the population well. I think I know a lot of areas in which that we may discuss with Patricia that public schools can do better in supporting boys. I just so happened to be, it was the night I brought my daughter home after she was born. My dog happened to be, not well. I think he was reminding us that, he was still very much a part of the family. So bring my dog home, bring my daughter home, pick up my dog, and we spent quite a long time at a vet. And while he was being looked at, I was in there in the waiting room, and an episode of Chronicle came on, and it was a focus on boys in public education. So I'd like to show you a clip of that Chronicle episode, which gives you kind of an introduction to Patricia McCarthy and the work that she does at her school.
The good news is that certain schools not only understand boys' behavior, they accommodate it in their curricula and teaching staff.
And at these schools, where boys learn is just as important as what they learn, especially among the youngest, as you'll see in just a moment. Story time, puzzles and blocks. Preschool may be fun, but it's also the time when boys being boys get into trouble, says Dr. Anthony Rayo.
The #1 group of expelled students in the United States is preschool boys, at 4 to 5 times more than girls of that age group. And so right from the get-go, you've got half the population trying to enter into an educational situation, often being tagged with disorders, learning disabilities, and aren't really joining in the process.
Boys, says Rayo, will always be at a disadvantage until educators realize their development is different from girls. Speaking of different, Rayo touts the curriculum of Drumlin Farm Community Preschool, particularly for boys. Director, Paula Goodman.
Drumlin Farm Community Preschool is a nature-based preschool where we use nature as the background for all activities that we do with the children. And in order to help them learn best, we believe that getting them outside in multisensory experiences is a great way for them to start.
Students spend half their day outside. In fact, the outdoors educates preschoolers, says Goodwin, who seems to truly understand the nature of boys.
Boys learn through very active play, and they love vigorous play. So we make sure that we have plenty for them to do in terms of gross motor activities, anything we can do to get their bodies moving. We find that after about 2 hours outside in nature, once they come inside, they're more easily able to sit for a meeting time.
Jane Chevalier says Drumlin Farm fits the bill for her high-energy preschooler, James.
He's a kid who's just in constant motion, and really as he goes forward, that's one of the things we think about and are a little bit concerned about. Coming here in the afternoon is so crucial. It enables him to really be physical, to expend a lot of that extra energy.
One town over in Concord is the Fenn School, an all-boys private school where students are encouraged to be active. A little roughhousing? No problem, says Headmaster Jerry Ward, who even allows running in the halls.
We do allow that, and we also interpret their physical behavior in positive ways. There are clear limits. There's no kind of behavior that's going to be hurtful to other boys. But we do take a look at their physicality, including sometimes, really kind of being frisky with each other and that kind of thing as positive.
Is it possible to bring him here?
Sure, it's possible. Fenn serves boys from the 4th grade through 9th grade. What sets this place apart? Teachers who understand boys' needs.
There's a lot of work that has shown in recent times that boys are also, as the girls are, very relational. They're really figuring out, is a teacher on their side or not? They really want to please, they want to give it their all, do their best. But I think, again, it gets back to interpretations of behaviors in proper ways, positive ways.
What kind of lines are lining up with other lines?
In George Scott's 5th grade math class, students don't sit with pencil to paper for long.
You have to rely on your classmates to match you up with the person that has the equivalent fraction. Here, it's really, really active. When it's activities that tend to be a little bit more desk-oriented, they'll do okay on those, but you can't do that all day long. Focus goes out the window, they start to get a little agitated. So anything you can kind of keep the pace of the class moving a little bit more quickly, get them up out of the chairs.
The way to engage boys is to play to their natural strengths, says Scott.
They love to collaborate, they love to work with one another, they love to play games, they love hands-on stuff, they love to solve problems. We try to structure classrooms that incorporate all those ideas.
From woodshop to athletics to the treble chorus, Fenn has a lot to offer boys. Surya and Cameron appreciate that.
Fenn really understands that we, as boys, really need to get the energy out. We really have a lot of excess energy. That's why we have 1 hour of sports every day, which is really fun.
Most schools don't have as much free playing time to get our energy out as it does at Fenn.
Nice work, you guys. Great job.
Okay, I'll introduce you to Patricia McCarthy.
I do have to say, we were all at home that headmaster, Jerry, happened to be in Florida at a conference, and he did the, you know, we allow them to be frisky and we allow them to run in the halls. So I had to, he actually called from Florida because I had to speak to him about something, and I said, yeah, thanks a lot, Jerry. You should see the madhouse that Fenn is today. Kids were noogieing each other in the head, being like, Mr. Ward said we could. But there is, I think Jerry gets at it very well, is that we do, I was speaking with a couple people beforehand, we really do embrace kind of the messiness of boys. We don't encourage it, but we do embrace it. And just to give you a quick background on me, so hopefully I have a little credibility. I have taught co-ed. I've also taught public, anywhere 6 through 12. And I just came to a boys' school as the head of the middle school. I was going to stay here for about 5 years, and I've been there now for 16 years. So you can tell I'm probably a little biased when I speak about the education of boys. But what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about kind of educational environments that are good for boys and that work for boys. And then a few other things about kindness and resilience, which I think we need to speak about with boys so much more than we do societally. And then open it up for questions. I think there's probably more collective wisdom sitting down than me standing up here. But I wanted to just introduce you to a couple of things. One was, this was a New York Times article. And it was about, it literally is entitled, How to Educate Boys. And there's an introduction to it, but then there's a bulleted list. And it says, a modern educational system must do these things. Decrease suspension rates for boys. That's absolutely true. Use educational modes that reach boys, and that's often collaboration and movement. Allow boys more physical activity. Our boys get an hour of sports each day and at least 15 minutes of recess. Sometimes if it's a nice day and we finish lunch early, they'll get a recess in the morning and then a recess after lunch. And that's right up to 9th graders. Fenn is grades 4 through 9, all boys. And they just go out and they run around and they do what you were seeing here. Facilitate introspection and sense of self-worth. Boys aren't socialized to think about their feelings, to be cognitive about what am I feeling right now. For boys, very often, sadness switches right over to anger. So as a parent, if you're seeing anger, always ask the question, is he really angry, or is this about something that he's really feeling hurt about? Because like I said, often anger is sadness. More reading, writing, and communication opportunities. Boys are not necessarily communicative. They're really relational, as Jerry was saying, but they don't want to admit vulnerability. And I can't tell you the number of times I've had a middle school boy in my office crying because his best friend didn't pick him to work on the Spanish project with him. But would he have done that in front of his peers? Absolutely not. And I'll speak more to that about kind of boys' emotional development. The recommendation in this article to the New York Times was to develop single-sex schools. In public education, I've been there, virtually impossible. So as much as you can develop opportunities for single-sex experiences, public schools are experimenting with that. And then I wanted to read a few quick things, and then I'll speak more casually. But this was from a blog, a learning blog that I wrote. I belong to a learning blog community. So this was last year, and I actually read this to the teachers last year, and I said, I recently attended the annual conference for the National Council of Teachers of English. I was able to take in several informative and useful presentations. I attended an afternoon session titled From Blocks to Social Media, Boys Play-Based Composing of Self and Story, which is one of the recommendations here, is get boys to kind of tell their own story and be contemplative about their lives. The presentation was an examination of case studies from a preschool play model with blocks, a high school virtual communication model using iPads, and then a college-level role-playing game model. And they were all intended to help boys construct meaning and establish identity. So I was, you can imagine, as the head of a middle school of boys, I was thrilled to go to this. The conference itself was really fascinating. But as engaging as this presentation was, it's not actually what I found most interesting. What did capture my curiosity was the nearly tactile nervousness, if not outright fear, about boys among the educators in the room. At times I've heard boys described as big, loud, noisy, scary, unable to sit still, all of which are true at points. And the tenor of the room was on pitch with those characterizations. As I listened to models of these 3 different developmental levels, I found myself being really thankful to work in a school that embraces boyness rather than pathologizing it as the boy problem. They're too loud, they're too active, they're too, place the adjective. Why do I find boys so wonderful to teach? The answers are as nuanced as boys are themselves, and they transcend stereotypes, they really do. Boys long to be useful, they want to be helpful. They often don't know how to do it, but they do want to be. They seek agency and action. If they see a problem, they want to get it solved, and they'll compete to get it solved first. They're very competitive. And they want to do it successfully. They want to be helpful, though for parents that's probably not a descriptor you'd assign your adolescent boy, I get that. But they do want to be helpful. They're actually tender, and we find on campus, just bring a puppy to the pickup line and watch boys as they wrestle to play with a faculty member's baby. And we find that that's one of the last few permissible things where a boy can be really tender and sweet, and it's societally acceptable. Other than that, boys are supposed to be tough, and they're supposed to be kind of mavericks and independent and not need help, which nothing could be further from the truth. Those instances provide safe avenues to be gentle, tender, and loving. Boys are witty, and they will see the humor in just about every niche where it hides, whether you want them to or not. I can't tell you the number of times I can say in a day, if you're smiling right now, you're not understanding the expression on my face. And that's often very true of boys too. They're not necessarily emotionally literate in ways that girls are. Girls are astute. They can pick up those nuances. Boys, not as much. But they're not intending to be disrespectful. They just really get the message. They like to be funny, and they also like to be made to laugh. Even if sometimes it's at someone else's expense. They don't intend to be mean, but let's face it, sometimes it's funny when someone trips. While they're not really verbal, they are very social beings. Boys like to be in partnership, they like to be with friends. I've heard entire boy conversations where it consisted of this. Huh? Yeah. Dude. Best friends. And they've just had about a 15-minute conversation right there. They want to feel connected. They're loyal, loyal friends. They're moral, they're ethical, and often right and wrong is as clear for a boy as black and white is. They're also exuberant, joyful, wonderfully messy. And if you don't or can't love that, then they're hard to educate. I oftentimes will, when we're interviewing faculty members, I'll say, what's your messiness level? How much can you tolerate? Because if you can't in a boys' school, or with boys, not just in a boys' school, then you might want to rethink it. This is from Jerry Ward, the headmaster, in one of our magazine addresses. He says, we start always with our own observations about boyness. We see over and over in our boys endless physical energy. I'm sure you're seeing a theme. The aspiration to be just and even heroic. The joy in being physical, a delight in being comrades, friends, teammates, an appetite for competition, an eagerness to help, a desire to solve problems. We're saying the same thing. I'm just realizing now I'm reading you the same. I think Jerry copied me. I'm not sure I like that. And so, as we talk about educating boys, it is different for boys in the case of, especially in a co-ed situation. They're often with girls, and I'm going to stereotype here, but sometimes stereotypes are useful. They're often in a situation where the high-performing, rule-following, never forget their stuff girls are sitting right in the front row raising their hand for every question. Where the boys are sitting in the room going, first of all, I don't have my book. Second of all, I didn't do the homework because I forgot what it was and I forgot where to look to get the homework. And third of all, I have no idea what you're talking about right now. But they also want to save face around that. And I'll get to the saving face in terms of discipline in a little bit too. But the way we look at the way education best serves boys is it has to have several components. And there's an acronym for it that's kind of funny. It's called SPURG, which I like, which kind of has a messiness to it. Education for boys should involve struggle. They engage with it. It should involve play. It should involve uncertainty. They shouldn't necessarily always think they have to have the right answer. And boys are competitive. They often do want that. Education for boys and just experience for boys in terms of parenting, it should involve resilience. I was telling Justin I was at a conference last week, and one of the educators said that somebody told her herself something that her husband pulls on her all the time now when she steps in as a protective mom. And it was, prepare your child for the path, don't prepare the path for your child. And I think that's especially true of boys who just really are very competitive and don't want to admit when they have the vulnerability. So it's hard when you have a nonverbal being on your hands who isn't going to advocate for himself to sit back as a parent and say, all right, buddy, how are you going to solve it? Because that's your problem. I take the 7th grade to Washington, D.C. Imagine this, 74 boys in Washington, D.C. And if they lose a card key in the hotel, I'll say, well, how are you going to fix that? And they'll just kind of stand paralyzed for a minute, waiting for me to leap in and say, I'll go down to the front desk and get you a new one. And it's a very small hotel, and so I say, I know what I'd do, but what are you going to do? The joke this year was, we don't stay in a very expensive hotel. It's a Comfort Inn, I believe. And I had a boy come running out of the room, Miss McCarthy, there's a cockroach in our room. And I said, that is unfortunate for you. My room doesn't have it. And he kind of stood thinking I was kidding, and I said, honestly, what are you going to do? I'd pick my stuff up off the floor at least. And so that's kind of become my mantra, which is, okay, so how are you going to solve it? Because boys will leap to that challenge. Excuse me. The last thing it involves is trust. Boys need for us as educators, I think all kids need this, but it's not as a parent in boys. Boys need us to trust in them, that when they've made a mistake or made a bad choice or done something mean or unkind, that they didn't mean to. Never ask the question, what were you thinking, because you know what the answer is. I wasn't. I didn't. But for boys, it's societally permissible for girls to cry when they're either in trouble or they've done something wrong or mean and say, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it. For boys, we don't preserve that. I love your model, Justin, of preserving their innocence a little longer. We don't preserve that option for boys. So oftentimes in a discipline situation, parenting and teaching, when you call a boy on a behavior and he's done it, they can get defensive, they can get almost offensive, and sometimes bordering on disrespectful, because they have to save face. Internally, what's going on with them, and I can guarantee you this, is they know they've disappointed you, and they don't know how to deal with it. Again, a girl could say, I'm so sorry, I never intended it. Harder for boys, and we need to model ways for them to do that. Our headmaster read a poem a couple of weeks ago in front of all school meeting, and he was so moved by it, he actually got teary, and he had to stop. And he was really apologetic about it. And I said to him afterwards, Jerry, boys need to see that. That's critical that this poem moves you. It's absolutely so important that they see you as their role model, able to be kind of emotionally vulnerable, especially so publicly. So they need to trust that we believe in their good intention. They also need to trust that we know that boys are messy, and they will make, in adolescence, they make crazy decisions. Their frontal lobes are so far from developed at this point, they've got a good another 12 years before they're actually making responsible decisions. There's no small reason why insurance company, the rates are highest for young men, for drivers, ages 17 through 25, because they do risky things, and often combine that with physical activity. And have you ever seen those ski videos where they're coming down on snowboards and onto a ramp and then do a flip into a parking lot kind of thing, or ski up a building? It's a broken arm waiting to happen. And riskiness combined with physicality, and there you have, boy. The thing about boys I think with discipline, and this was part of our focus last year, I think, when we spoke with your teachers, is I think discipline, I believe this of all kids, but because boys are not as verbal, I think discipline has to be redemptive. It can't just be, you messed up, you're in trouble, and here's the consequence. I think the consequence has to get creative in terms of, combined with my suggestion earlier of, okay, so how are you going to fix that? You did something really mean. You defaced someone's artwork. You can't fix that. You can't take that magic marker off that painting. So how can you fix it? what are you gonna do? And yes, we're gonna sit down and you're gonna write a letter and you're gonna address not just, all right, fine, I'm sorry, but why are you sorry? And what about what you did is worthy of being sorry about? But then also one more action step after that. So what are you gonna do? And that allows boys to be redeemed. Because oftentimes boys, even with one infraction, will feel that irrevocably let you down and that they can't retrieve that. And again, girls are so organized and so they can return or restore to good behavior like that. And again, I'm stereotyping. I was not like this as a student, believe me. But boys know that they're going to continue to be messy. And so in their minds, and boys have talked about this in my student life class, in their minds what is happening is, oh no, I'm just constantly going to be a disappointment. Now that is not to say never to tell a boy what you just did was wrong. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't do that. But it is to let him know. I'll tell you a quick story. I was having to suspend a boy several years ago. And there's a funny end to it, which is kind of connected, but he was sitting in my office and it was in that interminable time between where he'd gotten caught and suspended and his parents were coming to pick him up. That's eternity, and I've been there as a student. That's the worst time of all. Even when your parents are yelling at you, you're thinking, oh God, thank God, I'm closer to the end. So he's sitting in my office just catastrophizing about what awful thing is coming, is driving down Route 2 toward the principal's office or the head's office. And he was sitting there and he was inconsolable and there was liquid coming out of every orifice in his face. And you've seen it in your children where they get so upset they start to get the So he was in the throes of the and I put my hand on his knee and I said, Sam, buddy, you know what? In 3 days, I'm not going to remember, no one else is going to remember what you did wrong. What we're going to remember was in the moment, you were honest, you answered up to being involved with it, and you showed real courage. And then on your own, you went and apologized to the boy, sincerely, and that shows empathy. It's also really respectful when in the initial act you weren't respectful. And those are our 4 kind of core values at FEM. So I said, I'm not going to remember what you did. I'm going to remember how you responded and how you fixed it. And he looked up and he went, Ms. McCarthy, whoever would have known that it takes suspended to figure out that you're actually a nice person. But he came back. When he graduated as a 9th grader, he came back and he told me that. I had forgotten it. And he told me that story and said, and this is not me, it's anyone who does this. He said, you're who made it possible for me to come back to school the next day. Because I was so embarrassed by what I had done. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to show my face to the adults, not so much to the kids. Kids are pretty forgiving of one another messing up because they know they've done worse. But he was so afraid that he was going to come in and the adults were going to be... and so I do believe that discipline for boys has to be appropriate to what they did, the magnitude of what they did. But also it's got to allow them a chance to redeem themselves in any creative but genuine way that they can. And then the other thing I would say is boys, I think people think middle school boys are easier than girls. I really disagree. Boys are as nuanced and as complicated as girls are, but we don't hear about it as much because they don't speak about it as much. But they're as easily wounded as girls are in friendships and in social situations. They can be as jealous and as catty as girls can be. And I was a middle school girl, believe me, I participated in all of it. Add to that, for boys, it can get physical. So, you know, that friend who's just been really not picking them for the projects, have just been getting on their nerves, and in about 7th grade, a lot of their friendships, the tectonic plates are shifting, and they've been best buddies with someone since 2nd grade. Usually their mom's best friend's child, because the play dates are when moms get together. But in about 7th grade-ish, they start to develop their own identities, they start to make their own choices. Up until now, I talk about this with kids in student life too, I'm like, you guys, until about the 6th grade, the only choice you had was maybe what cereal you had in the morning. And that was probably limited to 2. But the rest of the decisions, more or less, any important ones, were made by your parents. Or the adults in your life who take care of you. But they hit 7th grade, they start to be more mobile, You start to be able to drop them off at the movies with friends and pick them up right afterwards, but they have 2 hours there where they're not in mom's presence, which can be a scary prospect. They start to have objects of affection, whether it's male or female. They start to be interested in others in ways that are really confusing to them. And you should hear some of the questions in my student life class. In fact, I'm shocked that they're not more embarrassed to openly ask some of what they ask. But I've lost my track. I do this all the time in my class. I'm very ADD. Someone remind me, where was I?
They're starting to be alone, so they're starting to make their own decisions.
So but what's happening as that happens is their friendships are shifting because they're starting to align around interests versus neighborhood friends versus mom's child. And that can be for a boy, for a girl too, that can be heartbreaking because their best buddy isn't choosing to be with him anymore. And again, girls have the avenue, societally, to be able to be openly sad about that. Or to be mean to one another about it. Well, you said, well, that's an ugly sweater. For whatever reason, that's not okay either, but it's not as shocking. For boys, that opportunity really doesn't exist. Society doesn't provide it. So do be aware that, you know, as your child's friendships, particularly boys, as they shift, they are feeling that profoundly. Not all, but most are feeling that really profoundly, and they have a deep, deep sadness around it. And when I was saying earlier that sadness for boys often translates into anger, that oftentimes is when, if your son's coming home and being like, you should have seen what Tommy did today, and Tommy starts to become a theme, there's a couple things going on there. Either Tommy isn't being kind, or he and Tommy were best buddies, and things are kind of moving apart right now. The other thing I will say for middle school students, and boys in particular too, is as much as we try and get boys to be vocal, we can start to interview. Michael Thompson, who's a really prominent psychologist for boys, calls it interviewing for pain. So if we know our boy is struggling with some particular kid is being mean to him, or with his best buddy or whatever, don't have him get in the car and go, how was Tommy today? Because then he'll tell you, and then all you'll hear is the bad news. And then in some ways that will shift his focus onto the struggles and the bad news. When oftentimes in a day, as we were saying earlier, son gets in the car and you ask him what he did at school today, nothing. And I use nothing deliberately. What'd you learn today? Stuff. Huh. Anything interesting happened? No. We all know that's absolutely not true. I mean, their day, if nothing else, is not, I mean, as teachers we might be boring, but their days are interesting. And so the other thing I would say about boys' attention spans is they are limited. And so I tell the kids at the outset, I say, guys, this diagnosis didn't exist until I was a teacher, but I am absolutely certain I am ADHD. There's no doubt in my mind. Boys are highly overdiagnosed for both of those things. And largely because, not largely, but often because they're boys. Their attention span is shorter. They do need to move. There is, if you watch the longer piece of this, there's one shot of a boy who's, you've seen it. Do you have anyone in your family who does the leg? I have a brother-in-law who's good. No wonder he's as skinny as he is, because he's constantly burning calories. And there's a shot in that, it keeps going back to this boy's leg, who's going do. So boys, they really need to be moving, and their attention span is different. I will be sometimes, we'll be in class, we'll be doing, maybe reading aloud or something like that, and I'll just get a sense of the kind of shuffling of the noise of the room, and I'll say, okay, this isn't working and I'm boring myself, so everybody get your book, field trip. And if it's a nice day, we'll go outside and we'll read on the front lawn. And just the walking to outside. Sometimes in my class, if there's a boy who I know really struggles with, if we do have to do an activity that's going to have us seated for a while, I'll make something up. And he knows it. I've kind of shared it with him, but here's our code. If I ask you to run over to the office to get me tape, go and do it. But that's just a little time for you to take a little bit of a walkabout, because I'm noticing that your energy is really high. I say all of this with the understanding that I have the luxury to do that. I teach in an all-boys school. It's an all-boy culture. We have to spend a lot of time working with them. The female-male faculty ratio is 50-50, and we work on that intentionally. But we spend a lot of time with boys talking about how to be respectful of women and girls. We actually teach that in my student life class about, okay, what are ways where, even unintentionally, you're speaking about people in kind of a demeaning way, or if not, respectful way. But it's very easy for me to kind of give a list of what you should do with boys, because that's all we have. Some of the stuff that I do, I never could have done in my co-ed classes, and that's hard. So the opportunities to find boys with just boys are really important, even if that's in small groups of friends. But groups of boys are really important for boys to work together. And I'll leave you with this, and then we should go to questions, but James Joyce I was speaking earlier as well. James Joyce, who is a really famous educator and philosopher, was talking to a group of Harvard graduates in the late 1800s. You can Google this quote, it's pretty famous. He was talking to Harvard educators, all of whom were men, and all of whom in the late 1800s would be educating boys. Girls weren't availing themselves of public opportunities or weren't being given them at that point. And he stood up there and in very kind of formal and vaunted English said, you would be best advised, this was at their commencement speech, you would be best advised to consider your pupil subspecie boni, which means just under the species. A little bit faded, partly free, because he was talking about their activity level. Partly faded, partly free, and always messy. If you can understand that and embrace if you can apperceive your pupil that way and embrace him, you'll be in the best possible position to becoming perfect teachers. So there's an educator saying, let them be messy, embrace it. But to Jerry's point too, there is a limit. This is not just saying, okay, boys' school, anarchy, craziness rules. They have to be safe, they have to be respectful, and they have to be respectful of other people's feelings. I will often tell boys, when you're doing this to your buddy, what feels like a hug to you feels like a headlock to him. So they have to be taught about their physicality too, because that often happens. And their answer also will be, boys don't understand facial expression as well. They'll say, but Miss McCarthy, he was laughing. And I'll say, he had to laugh, buddy. Everybody was there and watching. Do you know what he did when everyone was gone? Did he cry? Yeah, he came to my office and said, this felt terrible. And oftentimes I will sit boys down together and say, okay, you guys solve it. What did it feel like for you? What do you think it felt like for him? Okay, so where's the disconnect there? And if I'm successful, I get both of them crying. Because the first one will be crying because he's so upset, and the second one will be crying because he feels so badly about what he did and he didn't mean to do it. And then I do the old, my grandmother's thing. Okay, can you guys stand up and shake hands? And they can, and they'll usually walk out of the room doing the, dude, good, good. And I will stop telling stories. One last one about boys nonverbal. 4 boys in my office years and years and years ago, they're grown men now. And they had at a dance, they had taken the sticky labels off of under the artwork and put it on the artwork, and they thought that was funny. And as I'm talking through with them, I was guilting them out, unbelievably. I planned to redeem them later, but I was in the moment making them feel really responsible. And I said, you guys, somebody worked for hours on that and created a piece of art, and you, because you thought it would be funny, peeled off a label and stuck it on it, and now that can't be retrieved. That piece of art can't be recovered in its form. So I had them, all 4 of them, crying by the time, and I said, I'm going to step up, and I'm going to let you guys talk about what you're going to do to solve this and to make it right. So I didn't close the door, and I just stepped into the office and kind of stood, and there was very little talking. Well, we can take the stickers off. No, we can't. She just said they won't come on. Well, we could maybe write them letters saying how sorry we were and we weren't thinking. And so they arrived at what they were going to do, and they're probably about what I would have done. So I came back in, and they were all still crying. And I think the reason they could cry in front of each other is they all knew that they were in trouble for the same thing. So it's not like they had singularly lost faith, that they had all done. So I came back in, and I said, okay, well, it sounds like you guys have a plan. Sounds like you made a bad choice, but you're going to do something now to set it right, and I give you credit. That takes courage. I said, so you can go back to class now. And they were seated behind me, and I turned back to my computer at my desk, and there was no movement. And so I turned around and I said, you guys are good, you can go now. Still no movement. And I said, you want to just sit here? They didn't want to go back looking like they were crying. Now a girl would say, can I just sit for a minute, and do you have tissues? And is my mascara running? Well, I said, do you guys need to sit here for a minute? Totally nonverbal, just had, So they sat there for about 5 minutes, and I said, and just absolutely silent. I said, okay, how are we doing, guys? You ready to go back to class? This is how they checked with one another. Again, a girl would say to the girl next to her, do I look like I've been crying? Should I, splash cold water on my face? This is how it looked between the four of them. The only words I heard were, no, you're good, dude. That was it. That was absolutely it. And it was all nods and grunts. So if you're not getting a lot of words out of your son, don't mistake that for there not being real emotional depth there. And real moral depth in them as well. So.